Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great, Mike. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Great. I'm super excited for this topic. The you know we're here. We have you here talking about pressure, resilience, how to perform. This is just like an absolute amazing topic for me. So I'm super excited. But I also love backstory. So I need to start. I start off every interview with this question, and that is, tell me a little bit about your first job. And you can take that however you would like, if it's as a kid or college or whatever.
Yeah, God, that's a great question because I feel like everybody has a story when you ask them about your first job. Um, I had odd jobs here and there as kind of a young teenager, but where I think I would start if I was asked about my first real job is in my summers during college. And I went through my undergrad for business. And kind of the thing to do as an undergrad in business was to get progressively more prestigious internships kind of as you went through your 4-year undergrad, so that by the time you graduated, you kind of had this track record of, oh, this is somebody who's worked at, a blue chip investment bank for 2 summers, or, a consulting house for a couple of summers. And that was kind of the sort of staircase to heaven, if you will, of the 4-year undergrad. I had a very different kind of view of what summers were for. I think as a 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old, I had grown up spending my summers going to an overnight summer camp since I was about 9 years old. And so I spent all 4 summers in undergrad with progressively more kind of senior staff roles at that camp, working my way up eventually to the head of the sailing department, which was a team of about 10 or 12 folks, and then eventually becoming one of the directors in my 4th summer. And it was really interesting because it was a very non-traditional kind of resume to come out of a business degree with. But I think it actually stood me in pretty good stead because I had been in a position where I was managing reasonably large teams from the time I was kind of 20 or 21. The other thing you get when you're a camp counselor is, we would take groups of 10 boys, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds into a park for 5 days. And this is pre-cell phone. This is and as an 18-year-old, a 19-year-old, to be fully responsible for 10, 11-year-olds over a 5-day canoe trip with portages and paddling. And so I actually felt really good and quite well prepared coming out of those summers. And I think that we're here to talk about career. I am a big believer in taking taking full stock of your ability to kind of direct your career path in a way that's maybe a little bit different than the kind of accepted or traditional route that people kind of expect you to take. So definitely for me, that was that's a job that I look back on fondly. My son's going to that camp this summer, so yeah, it was a pretty memorable one for my first job.
That's great. I mean, you think about some of the underrated skills that you're developing there, right? Like operations, yeah,
Yep.
HR, and just managing people at a really young age. And I think like it's funny. You're dead on with the internship thing. Those again are just like underrated skills. And when you come into an interview and you've got all of this experience actually managing people, like you kind of set yourself apart. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a hook too. I do think about the Seth Godin thing, where you really want 100 raving fans instead of trying to appeal to 100,000 different people. And I would say the same thing about my second job, which was planting trees in the north, which is not a job that I actually fully endorse. It is really, really brutal from a physical labor standpoint. But I will tell you, you get into a job interview with somebody else who planted trees, and they're like, "Oh, you planted trees up north?" And it's like, "Yeah." They're like, "Man, that's a tough job." And it's, so you don't hit those people all the time, but when you do, it's a very, very, there's a real kinship there, which I think is helpful for sure.
And when you say up north, I mean we're talking up north, Canada, right?
Yeah, so I'm based in Toronto, and
That's right.
Toronto's not. You tell somebody from Canada you're from Toronto, that's the south, right? But I'm talking 14 hours north of Toronto. I started May 5th, and it would go down to the low 20s overnight. You'd wake up in a tent with your boots frozen, your clothes frozen, your water bottle frozen. Yeah, it was an interesting experience.
Excellent. All right. So starting there and kind of fast forwarding to what you do now, you're CEO of Third Factor. Can you give our audience a little bit of idea of what you guys do today?
Yeah, so Third Factor, we're an interesting little business in that we're kind of like a big cross pollination hub. So we sit at the intersection of a bunch of different environments, principally the worlds of elite sport, academia, and business, and we try to figure out what we can all learn from each other. So the business actually got started about 30 years ago by my parents. So it's the family business for me. And, my father has a PhD in sports psychology. My mom's a clinical psychologist, and they were really working on the mental side of sport. That's where the business got its start. There was this, emerging discipline of sports psychology. It was kind of a bit of a dark art at the time, honestly. You tell people, "Hey, I'm a sports psychologist," to be like, "Okay, what? You got shock paddles back there? Is there like a fainting couch? Like, what are you guys doing behind the curtain?" And they were really working at the forefront of what does it take to help somebody mentally prepare to perform under the pressure of international competition. In kind of the early 90s, people in the business world started to get really interested in this. Hey, the stuff that you're doing with athletes, this could be useful to anybody that has to perform under pressure. And that was kind of the way everything got started. And the way I talk about it now is we're just trying to figure out across the world of elite sport, particularly Olympic and Paralympic is where we really cut in. Academia, so I teach at UNC in Chapel Hill and then Queen's University up here in Canada. And then the work that we do in the corporate side, there are certain things that are just kind of fundamentally true, whether the pressure comes from sport, business, school, life, about what it takes to perform under pressure. And there are certain things that are just fundamentally true about what leadership means, regardless of whether you're a coach in sport, a manager in business. And so we're trying to figure out what those things are and then help people learn to get better at them. So we spend most of our time in the business world. I spend about 90% of my time, teaching leaders and individuals in business, teaching at business school. But then we have these great R&D labs, in the world of sport that really help us kind of understand what's going on at the edges of performance.
Interesting. So as I was researching, there's really two words that stick out to me from all of your work. So pressure is the first one, and you just kind of touched on it. And you have a upcoming book all about pressure coming out August 31st, which we're going to dive into as well. But the second one is really resilience. And I want you to talk to me a little bit about resilience. I come from the finance world, and I actually think about we actually have a saying here, and it's not really mine, but resilience is brilliance. Because what I'm trying to do here is teach people essentially a risk mitigation strategy around resilience, right? So getting a side job, having multiple streams of income, those types of things help you be more resilient. How do you define resilience?
Yeah, it's interesting. Resilience is one of these topics that has become a bit of a touchstone in so many different fields. Cities now have chief resilience officers because of, Hurricane Sandy and what we learned from these natural disasters about what it means to be a resilient city. To your point, you're talking about resilience in the structural sense of like, okay, what happens if, one job goes away or the economy, do I have, multiple points of failure or redundancy? Right. And I think that's one of the things that's kind of interesting about resilience. You can talk about it at the individual level. You can talk about it at the team level, the system level. There are multiple levels to talk about it at. I think I come to the topic of resilience, principally through the lens of performance and health. And both of those kind of over time under pressure. What does it mean to sustain? And I tend to kind of define resilience at an individual level as some combination of three things. So the first is resilience is a set of stabilizer muscles. It's about when you get shoved off balance, can you get back to center? And I think this one is a pretty important one, that resilience for me is not about, how do I adopt such a stable posture? Like, how do I stand with such a wide base that I just never get off balance? I don't think that's actually a particularly productive way to think about it. For me, resilience is like, I'm going to get knocked off balance. Do I have the stabilizer muscles to fire to get me back in balance? The second thing that I think of when I think of resilience is an ability to take the energy under pressure and use it to grow. There's a lot of heat and light around this whole notion of post-traumatic growth and what does it mean to use failure as fuel for growth, and I think that's an important part of resilience. If you read books like Anti-Fragile, often people will differentiate. So Nassim Taleb will differentiate between resilience and anti-fragility. I think it's a bit of a continuum. I think I would kind of characterize really resilient people as those that do actually bounce back stronger, from the setbacks that they encounter. And then the third thing I think, and this really comes from our work in sport, is I think there's an element to resilience, which is about under pressure, can you get out what you're capable of? When we're working on resilience and mental performance with athletes, really what we're looking for is, can you peak at the right moment? Does pressure help you perform, or do you shrink in the face of pressure? And both of those are eminently possible, right? We see people choke all the time. We also see that there are more world records set at the Olympics than anywhere else. Why? Because there's pressure, right? Pressure can be hugely energizing if we channel it appropriately. So I do think that combination of, it's stabilizer muscles. Can I get back when I get knocked off balance? It's that ability to actually use pressure as fuel for growth, as opposed to letting it take me down the garden path to burnout or regret. And it's that ability to kind of peak, under pressure, to let, pressure power you a little bit. So three different and listen, I think everybody has their own definition of resilience, but that's kind of how I tend to come at it.
Interesting. Yeah, I like your point of view on the continuum. I'm a Nassim Taleb fan. Not everything you do can be anti-fragile to the one extreme, but this ability to, there's definitely an element of the bounce back factor, right? And coming back stronger. And then there's also an element of like, how much can you sort of foresee and plan for? And again, to your point, if you try to plan for everything, it's probably a unproductive use of time and resources. But there are certain things that you sort of can plan for, and that, manifests itself in how resilient you are. Okay, so this other word that we've been throwing around is pressure. And I want to get a little bit of a definition around pressure as well, because as you and I were talking just before we went on, I can certainly feel, there are times when I have performed well under what I would call pressure, and times where I have not. And it's really this conundrum of, gosh, how do I do that? How do I react to these things differently? What are the environmental factors or the things going on that are causing me to sort of perform differently? So let's get a little definition around pressure.
Yeah. Okay. So this is, a topic that is very near and dear to me, having spent the past kind of 4 or 5 years really thinking about pressure. So I want to start, one of the questions I often get around pressure is, okay, is stress the same as pressure? Is pressure different from stress? How do you kind of delineate between these two? And, I do think that delineating between stress, fear, pressure, grief, when I ask people what's the most pressure you've ever been under, which was, the foundational question for the book, that's where kind of pretty much all of the insights I got on pressure came from, was just having people tell me their stories. I actually came to realize that, what people classify as pressure is a pretty vast range of human experience, some of which I would agree is pressure. Other stories I heard, I would say they were probably more in the lane of fear or stress. And so I kind of started to, develop a little bit of a working definition as these stories kind of landed, and I started to sort them a little bit. And so the first thing I would say is the difference between stress and pressure is really about influence. It's about the ability to act and influence a situation. And the example I always use is a basketball game. So my wife is a huge Toronto Raptors fan, to the point where, if it's a close game in the fourth quarter, she cannot watch it. She has to leave the room and get updates via text message from me, because she finds it so stressful to watch the game that it becomes uncomfortable for her. So for me, that's stress, right? She is stressed. She is feeling stress in that moment. It's not pressure, right? Pressure is playing the game. Pressure is you are on the court and you have the ability to influence the outcome. And so I think we can feel stress in a wide variety of contexts, whether we can influence the outcome or not. Pressure requires this ability to act, that I actually have to do something, in order to influence the outcome of a situation. So that to me is kind of the first thing that delineates pressure a little bit from other situations. when it comes to, okay, so what creates pressure then? Broadly speaking, we really only need two things as human beings to feel pressure. So as human beings, the first thing that has to be there for us to feel pressure is importance. I have to be doing something in which the outcome matters to me. I have to, my brain somehow has to have coded this as this is important. Because if I don't care about something, if it's meaningless to me, it's not going to create pressure. The second thing that has to be there is uncertainty, right? Because if something matters to me, but I know exactly how it's going to turn out, it's also not really going to create pressure. It's that combination of, hey, the outcome of this is important to me and it's uncertain. That's where we start to experience pressure as human beings. And so for me, there's a pretty general kind of working definition of pressure, which is the need to act in important, uncertain situations. And there's a real relationship between importance and uncertainty. So I talk about the pressure equation a lot in the book. That's kind of the central framework for the book. And the first part of the pressure equation is importance times uncertainty. And that's because, if there's a really low level of importance, I need a lot of uncertainty to create pressure. If there's a high level of importance, I only need a little uncertainty to create pressure, right? If I buy a $5 lottery ticket, the 99.99% uncertainty does not create that much pressure. If I'm getting wheeled down the hospital corridor for an operation with a 95% survival rate, the 5% of uncertainty is going to create a lot of pressure. So there is that interplay between, importance and uncertainty. And then the final part of the equation is volume, right? So how much importance and uncertainty am I being asked to carry right now? Just how big is the pile that I am carrying around right now? And that's really the multiplier on the equation. So it's, importance times uncertainty times volume. And depending on whether we're talking about pressure in moments or pressure over the long haul, different elements can dominate, right? Importance, uncertainty, volume. And I know we're going to get into that in a bit, but those are kind of the three things that load onto pressure from my perspective.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I don't want to split hairs, but like for the player on the court, right?
Yep.
Who is feeling pressure and has an ability to affect the outcome, he or she could still describe their situation as stress, correct?
Yes. Yeah, it's
Okay.
kind of like the rectangle square thing, right? Where
Gotcha.
all
Yeah.
squares are rectangles, but yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Okay, cool. So when we're talking about importance, uncertainty, and volume, there's sort of load, there's time components, and then there's this individualized reaction to all of this. And as I kind of said before, obviously different people react to pressure differently, and people react in different situations differently. What have you learned about maybe some of the differences? If we could pick apart a couple of these, what makes a person perform poorly under pressure?
So, it's interesting. Let me start that again and quit the Outlook so I don't get the ding. There we go. It's interesting because one of the big things that I learned from the book research is that pressure isn't one thing, it's two things. And what I mean by that is there's actually a really big difference, both in terms of how pressure manifests, but also in terms of how we need to respond to it when we're talking about, what I came to call peak pressure moments versus when we're talking about pressure over the long haul. Both can be pressure, but actually, they're quite different in terms of, to your point, what has us perform well or poorly in those situations. And actually, I think, when you look at people who are quote unquote good under pressure, I think most of the time when we talk about somebody who's good under pressure, we tend to be thinking about people who are good in the peak pressure moments. Like, who do you want taking the buzzer beater in Game 7? A Navy SEAL who goes in and clears a room, with enemy combatants. Like, those are the moments that we think about people being good under pressure. I guess I would argue that actually a lot of those people have very disorganized lives over the long haul. And that actually that ability to effectively navigate pressure over the years and the months, and that ability is in and of itself just as important, if not more so, an ability from a pressure standpoint to nailing the peak pressure moments. And so I talk about this notion in the book of becoming pressure ambidextrous, which is this idea that being good at pressure isn't about one skill; it's actually about two skills. The peak pressure and the long haul. And I know we're going to get into the topic of career. I think there's nowhere that's more relevant than in the top, in the realm of career. A career is basically made up of, performing at high levels through the long haul and then nailing one or two peak pressure moments where you get to elevate or, take the next step up the ladder. And so I do think for people who are thinking about how do I build a career, you got to get good at both of these things, if you're going to kind of take the arc or bend things the way that you want to. So, when you talk about what goes wrong under pressure, it comes back to the fact that all three of these elements of pressure, importance, uncertainty, and volume, all of these are basically double agents. They can be tremendously helpful under pressure, and they can also really sabotage our performance under pressure. And so let's use importance as an example, right? So we all know, thanks to Simon Sinek and Bill George and many others, that over the long haul, our ability to connect with importance, to get really in touch with the why behind something, right? This is a critical element to persevering under pressure over the long term, right? Can I see why this matters to me? Do I have a good sense of either how this is helping me grow or how it is contributing to others or how it's bringing me closer to people, the big kind of purpose-driven stuff. Importance in peak pressure moments can really sabotage performance. In fact, when I listen to people talk about choking, 80% of the time it's because they just could not stop thinking about how important this was, right? And so in as much as we want to bring importance close over the long haul and really connect with why what we're doing matters, in peak pressure moments, it's actually all about keeping importance at bay. And seeing things in perspective so that when I walk into that job interview, I'm not going like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, this is so important. If I screw this up, I'm finished. This is my dream job. Oh my God, you got to do this perfectly. So much is riding on this. So, it's kind of funny because depending on the time duration, actually the skill that you want to do and what can sabotage you is almost the direct opposite. And I saw this kind of duality or parallelism kind of play out in every aspect of the equation when I talk to people about these situations. So I kind of think about all three of them as kind of continuums, right? With importance, it's like, okay, am I trying to pull importance close and really connect, or am I trying to keep importance in perspective? With uncertainty, it's like, okay, am I acting to corral uncertainty, or do I need to back off and just accept that uncertainty is inevitable? With volume, it's okay. There are times when I need to really build the physical platform so I can handle volume. I need to make sure that I'm building enough, a big enough container. And then there are other times where what I really need to do is just relentlessly eliminate volume so that I can focus on, a couple of things that really matter. And where I want to be on those three continua really depends on, okay, am I optimizing for the long haul or for peak pressure here? So that's maybe a bigger answer that we could unpack, but that's kind of at a high level, that's kind of what I discovered.
Yeah, I can completely relate to what you were saying in your importance example, right? I mean, I can think about like being in VC pitch meetings and just thinking like, oh my God, this is, everything is riding on this. Isn't that really just, when it comes down to it, from what we know about psychology, neuroscience, like, isn't that just sort of like a mental trick that we play on ourselves, like sort of this neurotic thing where we just build things up way higher than their reality? And are the mechanisms to sort of tamp that down similar to what you might read in psychology and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this is happening inside your head, right? And I think we as human beings have a profound tendency to fixate and raise the stakes of our important situations, and they get raised in a bunch of different ways. So first and foremost, there is just, if you're walking into a big sales pitch or a VC meeting, almost by definition, you are focusing most of your attention on what's at stake, right? That's just a natural attentional anchor when you're walking, the size of the deal that you could win or lose, the commission check that's at stake, maybe this is an input to an early promotion, the degree to which your financing round is fully subscribed, like all this stuff is going to be front and center. And because when we get activated under pressure, when our physiology starts to get activated, our attention starts to narrow, which is just a hardwired physiological response. Like you can absorb less and less information the more activated your body gets. All of a sudden, we begin to lose sight of everything else in our life that is not at stake, in this meeting. Our family, our health, the love of our friends, the rest of the business and our base comp, and like all this stuff that actually is not impacted by the outcome of this conversation or this meeting. And so one of the attentional cues that I've really come to believe in and use is, when you head into these situations, yes, in the preparatory phase, you want to be focusing on what's at stake because that's what gets you to put in the work, right? This has to be important for you to put in the preparation work. When you're standing outside the door of that job interview or that VC pitch or that sales presentation, you need to really flip your attention to what's not at stake. Like what's waiting for me on the other side of this meeting, regardless of how it goes. Because that's the attentional cue that's going to get you back into more of a loose kind of state. And it's not that you're trying to like convince yourself that this doesn't matter, it's not important. Like, I don't believe in trying to fool yourself. It's, can I see all of what is true, right? Am I able to see that, yes, this matters to me? And you know what? There is 90% of my life that is not impacted by what's about to happen in the next 30 minutes. One of my more interesting stories on this, I sat down with Johan Koss, who is a Norwegian long track speed skater who in 1994 went into Lillehammer, the Olympic Games in his home country in Norway as the gold medal favorite in 3 events, the 1500, the 5000 and the 10,000 meter speed skate. And he talked about how the pressure was so intense that he felt he could not handle it. And he ended up crying under a staircase in his hotel. And actually, I will say, as somebody who's been around sport for a while, I think going into an Olympics in your home country as the gold medal favorite in an individual sport, like carrying it actually is, I think, the most pressure that you can experience in sport. Like the entire country is fixated on, you and you alone. And he talked about what really snapped him out of it was, he had talked himself up to a point where he was feeling that if he failed at the Olympics, he would become a failure for the rest of his life. Like that was basically the frame that he had kind of worked himself up to. And it was the fact that his sports psychologist was able to sit with him and talk to him about the rest of his life and say, okay, what do you want to do after sport? And he said, well, I want to be a doctor. And she said, okay, well, is losing at the Olympics going to make you a worse doctor? And he said, well, all right, maybe not actually. It actually might make me a better doctor because I could relate, to people that were going through tough times and were dealing with adversity. And she said, okay. Well, what else is created? Well, he said, well, the Norwegian people are counting on me. And she said, Johan, there's 4 Norwegian speed skaters that are going to win a medal. Do you think the Norwegian people care whether you or some other Norwegian wins it? And he said, well, okay, maybe. They probably don't really care whether it's me or it's somebody else, right? As long as it's a Norwegian. And so they basically just kind of disassembled brick by brick all of what wasn't at stake here, right? What's the stuff? Yes, the Olympics are important to you, but you don't have to load all this other stuff on. Let's broaden the aperture so we can see, yes, this is important. And there is all of this other stuff that is not at stake at play here. And so much of that, to your point on psychology, tends to be ego driven. I had one CEO talk about it as, psychic validation. This was a guy who took over the CEO role at a consulting firm 4 months before Lehman declared bankruptcy and the economy fell apart in 2008. And he said, I finally realized that what was actually creating the pressure for me was I had craved this psychic validation of being a successful CEO. And I had to come to terms with the fact that actually that didn't really matter. And this wasn't my fault and I couldn't control it, right? It was just the context. So yeah, I think so much of it is our ability when we are under pressure to not get fixated on what's at stake here, but to be able to disassemble all this manufactured importance and see things in perspective, as we're going into some of these high pressure situations.
Yeah, I can relate. So again, I'm thinking of examples from my own life when you're talking, right? And like, one of the greatest experiences of my life was training and preparing for an Ironman race.
Mm.
And I mean, I just connected so much with what you said around in the preparation phase, right? Like being zeroed in on what you're doing and all of that. Like I think it was such a peak state for me because I followed this process of prepare, 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 um, but then sort of let go of the outcome. Like I had
Exactly.
three different sort of tiered goals, and I said like if the conditions are perfect, I want to hit this time. Otherwise, like I just want to enjoy this day. Like I've prepared for a year. I just want to enjoy this day, and so I really let go of the importance of the moment.
Yep.
And so I've been doing some work with I have a performance coach that I work with, and we've been unpacking all of this and trying to apply that formula essentially to the next thing. Because I think it's the context for me. It's like this barrier of sport. I can nail it in sport, and then when you transition into a business role or a sales meeting or something like that, it's like all of that whole formula kind of goes out the window. So I'm super excited that you've kind of put a formula to paper that I can now sort of refer back to, to help me as I go. So I just wanted to say that because like I was just thinking about that moment, and
Well, and what you've
being able to
described,
deconstruct the
yeah.
importance of it and
Well,
bring
and
it
what you've
down.
described is certainly in the research for the book, I interviewed a lot of people who nailed their peak pressure moments and people who did not, and so some of these stories are triumphs and some of them are, lessons learned. And I think when you talk to the people who nailed their peak pressure moments, that's what you hear over and over again, right? I knew exactly why this mattered to me, and that got me to put in the work. And then when I got to the moment itself, I was able to trust my preparation and let go. Like I wasn't all in my head around, oh my God, this is so important. And like, what if I fail? And, it's like I got to a point where I was able to say, okay, I need to just be able to let go and perform. And I think that,
Sorry,
that's so vital.
yeah. Sorry, I felt like I had done enough. Like
Mhm.
I absolutely could say like I had prepared, and I was going to do as good as I could do, right?
Yeah.
And so it went well, and I think about that moment all the time, and I bring that up, and now yeah, we're in that sort of process of all right, like replicating that whole thing when if we're
Yeah.
doing going after a project or whatever. Um, so we've been talking a lot about these peak moments,
Yeah.
and you gave the example, the sports psychologist really helped. I'm fortunate, I have a coach. How can, if somebody's like preparing for an interview, right, or they're trying to like level up their career, make a big move, and there's a peak pressure moment that they're coming up on, how does somebody go about preparing? Like I really think, I really do believe that you almost need that external perspective, because you like, to your point, you were talking about, you get so narrowly focused
Yeah.
that you can't see the forest for the trees. So I'm a huge proponent of having that external vision on your situation. But like how does somebody enact that, or what else can they do to sort of be prepared, and then remember to smile and sort of let go of the of the outcome?
So, I think, you've touched on preparation. And I mean, I think that's, you know, it's not a secret, but that is the secret. And when I say preparation, I mean, prepare for pressure in the same way you prepare your responses to the interview questions that you think you're going to be asked. I think a lot of the time we go in with a game plan on the tactical side, but we don't go in with a game plan on the mental side of how am I going to manage this if I get thrown in the first 5 minutes, or, I get a hard question, or the interviewer seems antagonistic, or I have to wait for 15 minutes in the waiting room and I wasn't expecting it. And, my palms start to sweat. So I think, the preparation piece is vital from my perspective, Mike. And a couple of things that I think are really important. First, you have to get yourself in the headspace of what is it going to feel like for me in that moment. And what I mean by that is, I think one misconception people sometimes have of people who are really good under pressure is that they don't feel the pressure. And that's just not true, right? Being highly activated is an uncomfortable state. The most elite performers, their muscles are tense. There are butterflies in their stomachs. That, I talked to multiple Olympians who said in the 30 seconds when I'm in the waiting room before I go out, all I'm thinking about is, can I get out of here? Like, why do I do this? Why do I put myself, these are things that happen to elite performers and normal folks alike. And I think you've got to get that dialed in advance to go, okay, when I walk into this situation, this is a situation that really matters to me. The outcome is quite uncertain. There's going to be activation. So what is that going to feel like? Well, knowing me, my hands are probably going to get sweaty. I can imagine my heart's probably going to be racing. My breathing might be a little bit shallow. For me, sometimes my ears actually start to pop, which is a bit of a unique one for me. And I want to really imagine, what is that going to feel like before I get into the situation? And the reason I want to do that is because if I'm thrown by that, all of a sudden I start to go, oh my God, I'm choking. When in reality, this is just a natural byproduct of being put under pressure. And so if I can instead anticipate it and get into a situation where I go, okay, there's the palms. Yeah, there's my heart rate speeding up. Yeah, okay, my ears are starting to pop, right? This is what I expected was going to happen. Now this is just a natural part of the process that unfolds in your body when you get put under pressure. And so I think that is one part of it for me, is make sure you are honest with yourself and pre-playing what's it going to feel like when the pressure hits, so you don't get thrown by it. The second thing I would say, and this is just core mental performance sports psych stuff, is you need to have a really clear understanding of what are the process cues that you're going to use to redirect your attention away from the outcome and towards the things that you can control. And, focus on process instead of outcome is just, at the heart of, how do we make sure that we don't get overwhelmed by importance? How do we take control over uncertainty? All of that stuff is rooted in, have I identified in advance, what are the 2 or 3 things when I feel those feelings that I anticipated I was going to feel, what am I going to redirect my attention to in order to act? And that could be my breathing. That could be, I've got a great joke that I've got pre-located, that's going to break the ice. It could be that I have, a script for my first 45 seconds that I have memorized to the ends of the earth and back, so that I know I can say that on demand. And that's when my nerves are going to start to come down. But you need 2 or 3 things in your arsenal that you go, okay, these are things that are within my control that I can redirect my attention to when the pressure starts to hit. And so I think, if I was going to recommend even 2 things to folks, that would be it. Like, scenario perform in your head what it's going to feel like when the pressure hits, and then make sure that you've got 2 or 3 things that you can take control over at that moment that sort of redirects you back inside your body and out of, the bigness of the situation or kind of the outcome.
So at like a real tactical level, you can answer this from things that work for yourself, or maybe predominant things that you see across sport. But like, what are those things that people are doing? So is it visualization? I'm visualizing, every day this scenario. Or, is it box breathing? Is it, feeling
Right.
your fingertips, that type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, so at a very tactical level, I would say breathing is absolutely one that I recommend to literally everybody. It's very hard when your brain gets in a battle with your body. It's very hard for your brain to win. And I mean, the brain is part of the body, so I don't want to create this fake duality. But if your brain is going like, calm down, and your heart is racing at 140 beats a minute, and your breath is up at 20 breaths per minute, like, that's sending a very clear message to your brain that, like, I'm not calm. And so at some level, you just have to get your physiology under control. And whether it's box breathing, I'm a big believer in a breathing technique known as centering, which comes from Aikido, which is really, you try to make your exhalation twice as long as your inhalation. So into 4, out to 8. And on the exhalation, you focus on relaxing your shoulders as much as possible. But absent that, just the simple act of moving your breath down into your diaphragm and trying to slow it down as much as possible, is a very quick way to get activation under control. So certainly breathing, if you carry your stress or pressure physically, is a wonderful way to get started. Then there is just the straight routine, right? There is a reason why, Nadal and Federer and Djokovic all have a very, consistent routine before they serve the ball, because it gives them an attentional anchor that is within their control. And so I do think having a routine that you practice that acts as a point of, centering that, so at the start of every single job interview, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to put my bag down on the left-hand side of my chair. I'm going to take my notebook out, put it on the desk. I'm going to open it to the second page. I'm going to pull my pen out, write the date and time at the top of the page, take 2 deep breaths, and then look the interviewer in the eyes. Like having something like that that is really concrete that you can orient to can be quite helpful. And if you're going into group interviews, one thing that I picked up from Brian Orser, who's a 2-time Olympic medalist in figure skating and one of the most successful coaches in the world. One of the things that's unique about figure skating as a sport is you warm up in a flight of 6 athletes, and then the order in which you skate is drawn randomly. So you could literally just stay on the ice and skate right away, or you could have to go off the ice for up to 30 minutes and then come back out and skate. And you don't know that until, literally the moment that you're warming up. And so he talked about how he had a skating first routine, a skating second routine, a skating third routine, a skating. And so regardless of what got drawn, he wasn't thrown by the uncertainty, right? It was like, okay, we're in lane 4. I've got the routine for lane 4. I'm a big believer that, that stuff can really help when you're getting into these situations. The other thing that I learned from Orser that I use personally is if you are doing something that you've done before, he has this great question, which is, what's my average? What can I count on? And I have found that really helpful as I've kind of, built my speaking career. And if you're successful in building a speaking career, you progressively speak to larger and larger audiences, right? And, so you're lying in bed at night and it's the first time you spoke to 500 people coming up at 7 a.m. And then you're lying in bed, 6 months later, and it's the first time you've spoken to 1,500 people. And then, as that has kind of progressed in my career, I have found that question to be one of the most reliable ones for me. Is like, okay, what's my average? Have you ever really screwed one of these things up? And it's like, no. So my average is, on average, I'm going to go out there and do a really good job, right? I actually don't have to do something that is unbelievable for me, some kind of like, out of the ordinary, out of body experience. If I can just hit my average, that's actually really good, right? The average is pretty strong. And so again, each person's questions are going to be unique, but I do think those little attentional cues can be quite helpful.
Great. So the subtitle of your book is why pressure isn't the problem, it's the solution. We've been talking a lot about these high pressure moments and
right.
not how to avoid the pressure, but how to sort of avoid the negative stress effects of the pressure. Talk to me a little bit about why pressure is the answer.
Yeah, so let's start with, the subtitle is deliberately a little provocative, right? Because as we've just talked about, pressure can be a problem. I think you'd have to be blind to kind of say, pressure is just the solution. But what I think is really important is we have to remember that it's actually the energy under pressure that gives us the capacity to handle our highest pressure moments. And so when I say that pressure is the solution, what I mean by that is pressure is energy. And there's a reason that energy presents itself at the moment that we need it most, right? When we are heading into that big presentation or the big interview or the, whatever it might be. And so when I look at what is pressure the solution to, well, pressure is the fuel that tends to power the biggest periods in our life, the biggest moments in our life, right? I said earlier, where do more world records get set than anywhere? The Olympic Games. Why? Because there's pressure. When we look at the race to develop a COVID vaccine, what was that fueled by? It was fueled by pressure, right? The people that were doing this were fueled by, why are they working 18-hour days, 19-hour days? Because there's tremendous pressure there, right? When I gave birth to my first kid, thank God I didn't give birth to my first kid. My wife gave birth to all 3 of our wonderful children. And that's a very different form of pressure, which blows my mind every time I think about it. But, the first 90 days of your child's life, what is it that allows you to persevere through, 6 weeks of sleepless nights and abject terror that you're screwing everything up? It's the pressure that you're like, okay, that's where the energy comes from. So, when I talk to people about their highest pressure moments, and periods, frankly, over 8 months or 10 months, I think most people would say, I don't want to really repeat that. It's not like I got to a place where I loved it, and I think we would aspire to like thrive on pressure and feel it as like this. Often it's quite uncomfortable, and it's the energy under the pressure that allowed them to take it to the next level, that allowed them to access a more empathetic and resilient version of themselves in the first 90 days of their kid's life, that allowed them to nail that big sales presentation, that unlocked the, so pressure in many ways, from my perspective, is the solution to human growth and development. It is the fuel for human growth and development. It is the inevitable byproduct of pursuing things that we haven't done before. And so, yeah, when I talk about it as the solution, that's really what I mean. Because I think, if we think of pressure solely as the problem, I think we tend to build a life that insulates us from all the moments that can actually define our lives. When I listened to the stories I heard for the book, every one of them was about a defining moment in someone's life. And all of those defining moments were fueled by pressure, were accompanied by pressure. So yeah, I do think it's an essential input into human growth and development.
So how do you develop a, I guess, productive relationship with pressure over the long term? Because if it's the solution, I'm assuming that we need some downtime. We can't be running hot all the time, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so recovery is huge. And believe me, Mike, by no means am I saying, the solution is to just be under pressure 24/7, 365. So even when I'm talking about the long haul, when people told me stories that I would consider the long haul, they were often telling stories about, the 6 months leading up to a really big conference, or the 2 years leading up to an Olympic performance, or, the 8 months where they were caring for a sick parent while holding down a really tough job. So I'm not so much talking about the long haul of 80 years of pressure.
Right.
It's more these kind of periods in our life where we're just carrying, a particularly big pile. Absolutely, we need the downtime between periods of pressure. If you want to get physically strong, the muscle repairs itself in recovery, right? Sleep is just as important as the workout. So 100% over time, we need those moments of recovery. We need periods of low pressure. I think where we tend to thrive as human beings is in a little bit of a Goldilocks zone, right? Where we're somewhere between rust out and burnout. We don't want to go through life like elevator music, where it's just, inoculated and insulated from pressure. We also don't want to go through life redlining at 9,000 RPM all the time. And I think like where I have landed after not just writing the book, but actually, talking about the book for the past few months, is I really think if I, were to sum up the three things of importance, uncertainty, and volume, they are all sort of tensions. So when it comes to importance, the tension is I have to really believe that what I do is important, while at the same time not being overwhelmed by what's at stake. Like I've got to hit that middle ground of seeing how what I do matters without being overwhelmed. And importance is the same, right? I've got to be really good at taking action to tame the uncertainty that I can, while embracing the fact that there is uncertainty that I cannot tame, and being at peace with that. And at volume, I do have to build the capacity to handle volume. And at the same time, I've got to be ruthless at eliminating unproductive volume. And so I think life is found, or, a successful life under pressure is found in that ability to, productively manage those tensions and carve out space in the middle, where things are in balance.
So over the long term, is there a correlation between, I guess, internal and external pressure? I'm imagining a lot of our peak moments are sort of externally driven pressure that we build up in our heads. Over the long term, there's a lot more that we can sort of control in terms of what we focus on and all of that. Did you find kind of a correlation or look at that from an internal external standpoint?
It's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it as internal external. I mean, I do think, the long hauls tend to be more volume driven. So it's less about some highly important, highly uncertain thing that's creating pressure for me. And it's more that I've accumulated a high volume of stuff that is, taken together, creating significant pressure for a prolonged period of time. And so in that way, I think it is a little bit more externally driven, because it's more rooted in like, how many balls am I juggling at any one moment in time, than one particularly important and uncertain thing. It's interesting though, because when it comes to uncertainty, for example, one of the big patterns for me is in peak pressure, direct action is the answer, right? Like under peak pressure, it's eliminate any uncertainty that you can, right? Have your routine, over the long haul, it's about recognizing that you can't tame uncertainty. And if you try to tame all the uncertainty over the long haul, you're going to burn out. Like you have to come to a place where you are at peace with the fact that life is inherently uncertain. And I don't know how the present is going to look from the future. Yes, I feel bad, but is this really a tragedy? I don't know. Yes, I feel good, but is this really a triumph? I'll tell you in 10 years, right? Every moment is kind of suspended in in perfect uncertainty. So, it's interesting. I think you're right that it's the context that creates pressure over the long haul, like the external context. And I think over the long haul, more so than in peak pressure moments, it is that ability to be a little bit elastic in how I'm relating to things, to be able to go with the flow a little bit versus in peak pressure, there is more of a drive to control a little bit. So I don't know if that perfectly answers the question, but I think it's an interesting thought.
Well, it at least gives you something to think about.
Yeah, exactly.
Dane, this has been amazing. Guys, the book is Power of Pressure, Why Pressure Isn't the Problem, It's the Solution. It's available August 31st. Is that correct, Dane?
August 31st, but you can pre-order it wherever books are sold right now. And then, if you want to grab a physical copy on the shelf, it's August 31st.
Excellent. I'm going to definitely be ordering mine today. I can't wait to read it. I've got 3 kids also, so my reading time has gone down a little bit, but I still get to sneak off and do it sometimes. So Dane, thank you so much for being here. Can you tell our folks where they can find you, where they can connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on LinkedIn, obviously at Dane Jensen. I'm also on Twitter at Dane Jensen, and always happy to get emails as well. So dane.jensen@thirdfactor, THIRD factor.com.
All right, Dane, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Mike. Really appreciate it.